But you and I today are facing that very same question. What will you do with Jesus? Either you accept Him or reject Him. Either you crown Him or crucify Him. There's no other way. There's no neutral position. There's no choice beyond this, friends. What will you do with Jesus? Will you turn from...
Among all the crucial choices that face us in the world today, there is only one with such far-reaching consequences. Today, Amazing Facts speaker Joe Cruz leads us to face that question with dramatic urgency. His topic, the saddest story in the Bible.
But you know, Pilate stood there. He didn't know what to do now. All the doors seemed to be closing up around him. And he was trembling. Oh, I can just imagine him as he stood before those people now. And his face was pale, and he was quaking in every joint of his body, wondering what he could do now and what the next step might be. And as he stood there, suddenly a messenger came pushing his way through the crowd and raced up in front of Pilate and thrust a scroll into his hand. And he began to unroll it, and there it was, a letter from his wife, Claudia. And in this letter she had written, "Dear Pilate, have thou nothing to do with the blood of this just man. For I have suffered many things in a dream because of him this night." And Pilate stood there reading those words, and he began to fear even more, because even his wife now was receiving a message apparently from God warning him against destroying this man or having anything to do with his condemnation. And oh, how he must have been full of terrible fear at that moment. Say, have you ever wondered what those many things were that God revealed to Claudia that night in that dream, friends? I've tried to imagine what it might have been, and how it must have come to her so vividly and so graphically that she was inspired to sit down immediately and write this letter to her husband, interrupting him in his official judicial duties. Oh, it must have been a very fearful and terrifying dream that she had that night. You know what I think, friends? I think maybe God took her back in that dream, through the years, through the centuries, maybe all the way back there to the very beginning of this world. Perhaps she saw this earth after it had been created there in all of its beauty and glory. She saw it lying in its perfection, no sin, no blot or flaw whatsoever in all of creation. And then maybe she saw the entrance of sin into this world for the first time, and she saw the earth becoming more dark and more polluted by transgression and sin. Maybe she saw those long centuries of time when God sent prophets there to warn His people, to try to draw them back and keep them on the right path. And then maybe in her dream she was brought down to that day and that night when the star was shining so brightly over Bethlehem. And she saw those shepherds come and the wise men come. And she saw the little baby there lying in the manger, and she saw him being worshiped by those who came to bring their gifts. And then perhaps she was taken on past that and saw this young man as he grew up and began to go around from village to village teaching and preaching and healing the people. She watched him in her dream as he did those miracles, going from place to place. And then in her dream she was brought down to that very moment when this man stood before her husband and he was seated upon the judgment bench, and she watched that scene in her dream. And then perhaps God even revealed to her what happened afterward, and there were the 3 crosses on the hill, and the earth was shaking, and the man was dying between 2 thieves. And then maybe God took her on past that, even into the years of the future, down to our own day even and beyond. And maybe she even saw that glorious moment described by the prophets of the Bible and the writers of the Bible about Jesus coming back to this earth again. And there perhaps in her dream she saw the skies lighted up with that brilliant glory, and then the clouds rolled back like a window shade, and there was Jesus coming with all of His glory and all of His angels. And as she beheld this in her dream, and she saw the people standing around as they looked and beheld it all, she heard someone say, "And we believe in Him who died by Pontius Pilate crucified." And she woke up in a terrible fear, and she called for a servant and a quill and began to write, "Dear Pilate, have thou nothing to do with this just man. For I've suffered many things in a dream because of him." And now Pilate is standing there reading those words with shaking hands and wondering, what can he do now? The options have all run out. The doors have all closed up in front of him. And there seemed to be nothing left for him to do. Oh, my friends, if ever a man's conscience burned within him, Pilate's did that day. Don't you believe that? Oh, he knew exactly what he ought to do. He knew what he ought to do and what he had to do, but he wasn't willing to do it. He wasn't willing to do it. You see, he still had that idea that he could be neutral, that somehow he could let other people make those decisions and he wouldn't have to get involved. That's impossible. That's impossible, my friends. And so finally, in his desperation, Pilate said, "Bring me a pan of water." And they brought it in and placed it before him, and he washed his hands in the sight of those people. And he said, "I find no fault in him. Let his blood be on you. I'm washing my hands of this man. You take him and deal with him as you will." And they led Jesus out along the way of sorrows on the way to the outer gate. And Pilate turned around thinking that he had avoided it at last. But my friends, this was his fifth and fatal mistake that he made. He thought he could get rid of his guilt and his condemnation by merely going through some sort of a physical act of washing his hands. You can't do that. Oh, friends, there is no other way to be rid of our burden of sin and guilt until we do it through John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. You won't get relief and deliverance from your sin and guilt and condemnation, my friends, by doing something physically. You can't even work your way out of it. You can't perform any act that is so good and noble and commendable that God will recognize that as the justification of your life and give you freedom from sin. Oh, no. The only way that you'll ever find that is to have John 3:16 break right through into the middle of your life, where you see yourself as a sinner, lost and condemned and dying, and you see Jesus on that cross giving his life for you and taking your place in death. When you believe in that, friends, and you take Jesus as your Savior, then you pass from death to life. But only then. You don't get it by your works and by going through all kinds of outward ceremonies and actions. Pilate thought he could do it by just washing his hands. But that didn't do it, friends. They took Jesus and led him down that road called the way of sorrows. They came to the outer gate. Through that gate, along the path, winding up there to the hill of Golgotha of Calvary. He was carrying that heavy cross on his shoulders. And they arrived at the place of the crucifixion. And there 2 thieves had been brought. 2 criminals were to die with him on either side. They placed Jesus on that cross, stretched out his hands upon those bars, and his feet upon the tree. And then, my friends, angels of God looked down upon that terrible scene as it transpired on Golgotha. Those angels saw these men who were unworthy to touch the hem of his garment take those terrible nails and the hammer, and they drove those nails through the trembling flesh of Jesus. They drove it into those hands, my friends, that had created worlds, that had hung planets in space. The hands, I tell you, that had even created the tree upon which they were now nailing him. These men, unworthy to touch the hem of his garment, rebellious, evil men, spit in the face of the Son of God, the one who had created them. Those hands that had touched the brow of the sick and even the dead and brought them back to life again. Those feet that had wandered over the dusty paths of Judea and Galilee, going from village to village and bringing health and healing wherever he went. Now those feet are being nailed to the cross by those men, I tell you, who were unworthy to even look on his face. Oh, how you and I would benefit if we could have looked down on that scene with those angels, my friends. I'll tell you something, if you had seen it, and if I had seen it, we would never accommodate sin again, would we? If you knew what it cost Jesus, my friends, to pay that atoning price for your sin, you would never allow sin in your life again. You would turn away from it with hatred and abhorrence. And they nailed him there, and Jesus hung between heaven and earth for you and me. And my friends, I want to tell you something today. Jesus was not dying the same kind of death that other men died. You see, Jesus was dying the second death, not the first death at all. Sometimes we think of him as being some great martyr. Oh, no. That sacrifice that Jesus made on that cross was not just the ordinary death of a good man or a martyr at all. Jesus was taking your guilt and paying your debt and suffering your punishment, and the punishment for sin is death, the second death on the lake of fire. And when Jesus was hanging there, my friends, his Father had to withdraw from him so that he would die the same kind of horrible death that the sinner would have to die in the lake of fire. And so that's why he cried out in his agony there, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? You see, the Father treated Jesus that day as though he were guilty of every sin you have ever committed, that I've ever committed. And he had to leave him there to drink the dregs of that cup alone. And he died in the same kind of separation from his Father that the wicked will suffer as a result of their sin. And he did that for you and me. Oh, we can never understand that, friends. We'll never be able to explain it. But I'm glad he did it, aren't you? I'm glad he did it. Pilate went on about his business, trying to console himself that it was all just a kind of bad dream. And it would fade away after a while, and he'd forget about it. But you know, friends, he couldn't forget about it. Because those little rumors and reports kept coming back to him all the time. Rumors that Jesus was not really dead at all, that he was not out there in that tomb where he had been buried, but he had been raised from the dead. He had been resurrected from the grave. Pilate tried to push it aside, and ignore it. He knew that it couldn't be true, and yet it bothered him. In fact, it bothered him so much as those rumors and reports persisted that finally he couldn't stand it any longer, and so he called to him that centurion who had been in charge of the men and the soldiers that day. And he asked him the question. He said, look, I know this is not true. It couldn't be. There's nothing of substance to it. But nevertheless, he said, I've been hearing this, and I want to find out what you know about it. He said, I have been hearing that Jesus is not really dead out there at all, that he's no longer buried in that tomb, that he's been raised from the dead. Tell me, what do you know about this? And my friends, I can see that centurion turn pale and drop his head and begin to stammer. And I can see Pilate reach out and grab him by the throat and say, man, your life is worth nothing to me. Tell me what happened out there. Tell me now. And then the story begins to pour out. Yes, we were there. And we had the guard well stationed. We were on duty that night. But he said, in the middle of the night, as we were on guard, suddenly there came walking into our midst this tall, shining being. And he went over and touched that rock, that stone, and it rolled away from the tomb. And then he sat on it. And he cried out and said, Son of God, thy Father calleth thee. And he said, the one who had been inside came walking out. And we all fell down like dead men. And then we began to stumble into the city to make our report. But on the way we met the priest. And they offered us money if we would not give any report, and they promised to take care of it if this thing were ever known. And then for the very first time, Pilate knew without any shadow of doubt that he had crucified the Son of God. A terrible trembling seized him. A short time after this, Pilate was called back to Rome to answer to some of the charges that had been brought against him by the Jewish people. And on his way, the Caesar died who was ruling on the throne, and a new emperor was installed. And when Pilate arrived there, he did not recognize Pilate at all. He was dismissed from his position anyway. And he began to wander the streets of Rome as a drunken wretch, until finally, in his misery and his remorse, he took his own life. Somebody has written a poem entitled Pilate's Prayer. Why did I yield, O God, if God there be? Why have I been so blind, too blind to see that my reluctant sentence lay on me? He died in agony beneath the blistering sun. Upon a cross of shame he died, but one I thought to save myself at any cost. I kept my palace and my crown, but lost Yea, all I seem to have is slipped away. My friends, my land, my hope, my dreams of ease and pleasure. My very life, it seems, is one vast sepulchre filled with hideous bones. A carnal house of fear and ghostly tones, of memories that throng the fetid air, like black-winged ravens of defeat, despair. Thus fall into the depth am I, who might have been still wearing kingly honor, loved of men. I see but awful emptiness and gloomy end, nor any soul who cares, nowhere a friend on whom to call. They mock and curse me now, who once were glad before my feet to bow. No more can I endure. It seems to me as well to end with my own hands this living hell. And so Pilate took his own life. Oh, friends, today I want you to see you yourself sitting on that judgment bench. Because we're there. Did you know it? We're there. And Jesus is standing before every one of us. And the question comes ringing down through the ages into every heart of every person who is listening to my voice today. And that question is, what will you do with Jesus, which is called the Christ? What will you do, friends, with him? What will you do with him? There's not very much choice, only two choices. You can either crown him or crucify him. You see, Pilate wanted to fall down and worship before the feet of Jesus. I'm convinced that he began to see more and more that this had to be the divine Son of God. This had to be that Messiah that he'd heard about, that the Jews were always talking about. And this conviction had grown in him. And he wanted to do it, but he was afraid to do it. You see, these 5 fatal steps held him back. But you and I today are facing that very same question. What will you do with Jesus? Either you accept him or reject him. Either you crown him or crucify him. There's no other way. There's no neutral position. There's no choice beyond this, friends. What will you do with Jesus? Will you turn from sin and allow him to be your Savior? Will you accept him into your life to obey him and to honor him by keeping his law, by showing your love for him, by responding to him in submission and surrender? Is that what you'll do, friends? That's the only thing that we can do that'll be right. How can we reject a Savior like this, friends? Oh, I wish somehow that we could see the picture of ourselves sitting on that bench and Jesus standing before us. And the question is, what will you do with Jesus? Listen, the time is coming very soon when that picture is going to be reversed. And he will be seated upon the judgment bench, and you will be standing before him. And the question then is this: what will Jesus do with you? And what we do with him now is going to determine altogether what he does with us as we stand before him on that day. Somehow I wish that it could be impressed on our minds so vividly and graphically as it was upon the mind of that great Scotch theologian, Alexander White. You know, he had a dream one night. It was such a terrible dream that he was crying out in his sleep. And finally, his wife, Mary, had to shake him awake from the sleep. And she said, Alex, what's the matter? You were screaming and crying in your sleep. Oh, he said, Mary, he said, I had the most terrible dream I've ever had in my life. He said, I dreamed that I was standing in Pilate's judgment hall. And I watched them bring Jesus in there. And they stood him before that crowd and they stripped him down to the waist. And then I saw this big bruiser of a soldier take this long whip in his hand. And he stepped up there to my Lord and he brought it around with all of his strength. And oh, Mary, he said, I saw the blood flowing. And I saw the flesh of Jesus so lacerated. He said, it broke my heart. And then I saw him bring that great whip back again and I couldn't stand it any longer. He said, I sprang forward and grabbed the soldier and held his arm. And Mary, he said, he turned and looked at me. And he said, I was looking into my own face. He said, I was the one with that whip. I was the one who was beating my Lord. And Alexander White broke down and wept in the night as he remembered that dream. My friends, the Bible says that we can crucify the Son of God afresh. Have you read that in the Bible? We can crucify the Son of God afresh. You know how you do that? You know how you do that? Listen. In your imagination, in your mind, now go back to that hill of Golgotha outside the walls of old Jerusalem. Come back with me to that place of the crucifixion, friends. You look once more at Jesus as he hangs there on that cross. Why is he suffering there? Why is he dying there Listen, He was dying because of your sin. He was dying because of my sin. And if you could think right now the very worst thing you ever did in your life, the most shameful, evil thing you ever did in your life, that you were the most embarrassed about, the thing you would like to forget more than anything else in all the world, if you could just blot it out of your mind. If you could think of that very worst thing you've ever done, and I could think of the worst thing I ever done, and we could all put those things together, my friends, Jesus was paying the penalty for those sins that you and I committed. And if we continue in sin, do you know what we're doing? If we continue to sin, we're adding to that load of guilt that crushed His life out on Calvary. You see, Jesus did not die because of the physical indignities of that cross. Not because of those nails in His hands and feet, or the spear in His side, or the crown of thorns on His head. That is not what killed Jesus. Jesus died of a broken heart. He died because of that crushing weight of your guilt and mine resting on Him there. And every time we sin, listen, every time we sin, we're adding a little more guilt to that load that killed Him on that cross. Oh, friends, how could we do that? How could we keep on walking in disobedience to God? How could we keep on refusing to accept Him and acknowledge Him and commit our lives to Him? How could we do that? Oh, if there's anyone here who has not made that surrender and that decision to go all the way with Jesus, I want you to do it today. I'd like to invite you to do it. There are some here maybe who have never been baptized. You've never really sealed your love and devotion for Jesus by making any kind of an open public decision to follow Him and to belong to Him and to be His child forever. I'd like to ask you to do it, friends, today. I really would. I'd like for you to settle it once and for all that Jesus' death on the cross has made it necessary for you to respond to Him, and that you want to do it. You don't want to continue in sin. You don't want to keep away from Him or to be separated from Him. You want to come to Him and be a part of His family. It may be that there are those here who have been baptized after the example of Jesus. But you've learned new things here in the crusade. You've learned about God's law and God's love and a lot of the beautiful truths that Jesus taught. And you know you should do those things too. You should begin to keep the Sabbath. You should begin to follow all of the great counsel that you've discovered from God. And so you would like to make the decision, even though you've been baptized, you need to come and make that decision to follow these things that you've learned and to go all the way with Him. As we sing our song this morning, I'd like for you to come also. And then one other group of people, and that is the backsliders. Perhaps someone here has turned away from Christ and you've lost the joy of salvation. You don't have that peace and joy in your heart that you once knew. And you need to come back to the altar of God. You need to return to Him and open your heart and life to Him again. Shall we stand together as we sing this beautiful song? Our cameras are off here at the front, so don't be afraid as we sing this song, Come Just As You Are. Please come now as we sing, friends.
still nearer, close to thy heart. Draw me, my Savior, so precious thou art. Fold me, oh, fold me close to thy breast. Shelter me, Savior,